Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be giving you some tips to help make your photos sharper. Having sharp photos conveys professionalism with your photography and is also something that we all strive to achieve with our images. We can see the perfect image, but if we do not capture a sharp image, it is ruined. I would first like to talk about why your photos may not look sharp. There are several reasons why your images may not look sharp, and it can certainly be a combination of the following factors causing your images not to look sharp. I think it is most important to take a step back and note that if you are looking at your photos on a computer monitor and zooming way in, seeing the pixels of your image and wondering why the image does not look sharp, you need to reevaluate. The best way to tell if your images are up to the sharpness standard they should be is to get some high quality enlarged prints of your photos. Now, you don't have to get too wild with the size of your images, but get a 12 by 18 or 16 by 20 print of an image that you think is a good shot and see if it looks sharp at that size. On a computer, it is easy to zoom way in and not be satisfied with the result of a super cropped version of your photo. But take a step back and think of the practical application of your photography. How big will people be viewing your photos? What is the largest size you think your photo will be printed? Keep these things in mind when evaluating your photos for sharpness. On the other hand, it is important to take a detailed look at your photos and make sure they are sharp and in focus. So without any further delay, let me start by talking about the reasons why your photos may not be sharp. If your photo is not in focus, this will cause your photo not to be sharp. This is why I wanted to follow up my focus episode of the podcast with one talking about how to take sharp photos. This might seem obvious, but focus is very fickle. If you focus on the wrong part of the scene, such as focusing on a person's nose rather than their eye, your photo will not look sharp. Also, having an aperture that has a shallow depth of field is less forgiving than an aperture that has a wider depth of field. Depending on how you have your focus settings can affect this too. If you have single servo focus set, the camera will focus and then lock that focus in place. If you as a photographer move any, or the subject moves any, the image will no longer be in focus, since with single servo focus, the camera focuses, then locks the focus, and does not recompose if either the subject or the camera is moved. This leads me to the next reason why your image may not look sharp, which is movement. Whether it being your subject moving, such as a flying bird, or you as the photographer shaking or moving slightly, these movements will cause your image to become less sharp. Lastly, noise is another big factor that can cause your images not to be sharp. If you would like to learn more about noise, please listen to the podcast episode about ISO. Now that we've learned a couple reasons why your photos may not be sharp, let's find out how to get the sharpest images we can. First, make sure you are holding your camera properly. Use both hands on the camera, keep your elbows tucked in towards your body, and if possible, steady yourself against something like a wall. Also, when possible, use a tripod or monopod to help steady your camera. Next, ensuring your camera's shutter speed is high enough is also important. As a general rule, your shutter speed should not be lower than the focal length of your lens for hand holding your camera. For example, if your lens is 50 millimeters, your handheld shutter speed should be no lower than 1/50th of a second. I've also heard that ideally, if you are hand holding your camera, your shutter speed should be double that of your focal length. So with our 50mm lens example, a minimum shutter speed would be 1/100th of a second. This isn't always possible, but I try to follow this rule of thumb as often as I can to get better results. With your aperture, make sure that your depth of field is wide enough to accommodate what you are trying to focus on. Also, find the sweet spot on your lens for what aperture is sharpest. While a lens might be able to open up to a 1.8 aperture, this may not be the aperture where the lens is most sharp. It varies from lens to lens, so trial and error is how you find the aperture sweet spot on your lens. I should add here that you want to be using a good lens. You may want to spend lots of money on a snazzy new camera body, but your lenses are what really make the photo. While your camera body is certainly important, lenses are what really will make your photos look sharper. Also, if your lens has image stabilization, it is important to use this if you are hand-holding your camera. Another thing that can help make your photos look sharper is keeping your ISO as low as possible. While always keeping your ISO at 100 all the time is not usually reasonable, you should try to keep your ISO as low as possible. The higher your ISO, the more noise will appear in your image. This will make your image look less sharp, so keeping ISO as low as possible is important if you're looking for tack-sharp images. Keeping your equipment clean is another important factor to getting the sharpest images possible. Even if you don't think your camera is dirty, think about windows on your car or home. You don't notice they're dirty until you clean them and realize how much better you can see out of them when they're clean. If you're using filters on your lenses, make sure they are clean too, and if possible, don't use filters when they are not necessary, since they can cause slight blurriness in your photos. Lastly, I would like to go back to focus. It is important to make sure your focus is where you want it. Don't be afraid to take many photos. You would be surprised at how different the focus in your photos looks even when the photos are taken in rapid succession. This is the main reason why I wanted to follow up the focus episode with tips on how to make your images sharper, because the two are very closely related. However, as you heard, focus is not entirely the only factor that affects taking sharp photos. Alright, well I think that's all the bad advice I have for you for now about taking sharper images, so I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.